Cindy Kelly. It is September 6th, 2013. I'm in Oak Ridge, Tennessee with Bill Tewes. So Bill, can you tell us your name and spell it?
Sure. My name is William Edward Tewes, and the first and second names are obvious, but to spell my last name, it is Tewes. And I and my father and my children all pronounce it Tewes. The rest of my older family, including my grandparents, pronounced it Tewes. And my Uncle Elmer would remark, any fool should know it's pronounced Tewes because there are two E's in the name. My grandparents were had a famous member. That's Colonel William A. Tewes, who served in World War I in the infantry. He was called to active duty from I believe he was the first lieutenant in the New Jersey National Guard. And the reason I want to get to World War I is that World War I ended in an armistice. It did not end in a victory for the Allies. They were able to place a lot of very restrictive rules on the Germans, but there was no means of enforcement. So Germany was essentially free to rearm as long as they did a few things like keep their battleships below a certain size, but they very cleverly made sure that the guns were outgunning the British fleet. And the reason I mention this is that when World War II started, this country was greatly divided. There was a very strong isolationist movement, and the words that were said over and over again were, "We do not want to send our boys to fight another European war." Although we cheered for the Allies, and President Roosevelt managed to get a certain amount of material to them, like the 50 destroyers on the Lend-Lease program. We stayed out of that war, and we were completely surprised when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I can remember those days very, very specifically. I was in my sophomore year at Uppsala College in East Orange, New Jersey. It was a small school. It gave me a good scholarship, and the second year they added to it so I was able to live on campus. But the really good schools in the New York area all had a clause that you couldn't do any outside work, so that was about the best I could do. But I remember pulling off the road and listening to the radio, and I was just stunned. And when I got to campus, everyone was sitting around, talking. No one had any idea that we might be attacked. Oh, I guess around dinner time, the announcement was made that President Roosevelt would address the nation. And this was one of these dates that you remember, December 8th. I think it was around noon. I know I was sitting at a small table in the student union, and I remember that I was sitting there with Anya Larson and Bill Melchinger and Tewes Larson. And when President Roosevelt went down the aisle in Congress, everybody cheered. And one of his staff remarked later that usually it was only the Democrats who cheered. So we essentially united before he said a word. But his speech the date that will live in infamy was one of the greatest speeches of all time. And it took Congress, I believe I read somewhere 111 minutes to declare that a state of war existed between the United States of America and the Empire of Japan. I know afterwards we broke up, and a few people enlisted the next day, but not very many. The Army wasn't anxious to have a big enlistment because they really weren't prepared for it. Personally, I had no idea of enlisting at that time, but as time went on, the draft was functioning at the start of the war, and there was a path where one could enlist in the Army of the United States Reserve and complete their college year. Judge Hall and I decided that would have been the fall of, I think, maybe November of '42 to enlist, because we decided the worst thing that could happen to you is be to get halfway through, and then at the end of the war you'd maybe have a long time to wait before you could go back. And they guaranteed us we would get through that year. And I guess I was called to active duty in sometime in late June of '43. When the induction was at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and after a few days I was shipped to an infantry training center at Fort McCollum, Alabama. Now, one of the tremendously significant effects of World War II was the fact that people learned to move all around the country. Before World War II, I had probably gone 100 miles in each direction from Orange, New Jersey. You can go 100 miles east, but you have to go sort of a little bit north. The thing that impressed me the most, Fort McCollum was an army town. After 6 weeks, you got to go into Anniston, Alabama. And Judd and I just lucked into the fact that there was the Dixie Fireproof Hotel there. I think it was about 6 stories high. And all the locals were finishing Sunday dinner, but we had no trouble getting a table. And that was my introduction to Southern cooking. I thought, my mother used to make candied sweet potatoes that were terrific. But this casserole dish that they made was out of this world. I also learned that no matter what you asked, you could not get rare meat in the South. We went through the typical infantry basic 11 or 13 weeks. And essentially, what they were trying to do was to teach you to kill people, and to do it without any question. The second thing they wanted to do was to get you to obey orders without question. This meant if they told you to walk off the edge of a cliff, that you would do so, because you would count on them having some way to catch you as you went down. There are also a number of people who had a lot of difficulty with the thought of killing even an enemy man. And the Army had a solution for that. They became medics. And as far as I'm concerned, they were the bravest people in the Army. When everybody was hunkered down, somebody yelled for a medic. He got from being hunkered down and ran to the help them. After basic training, I spent about 4 days where my instructions were to just keep out of sight. You can come back to the company, training company, which now had different crews in it for mess. And after that time, we were shipped out and had no idea where we were going. One thing about trains at that time, there was no such thing as air conditioning. Summer was hot, and we stripped down to our shorts. We first experienced it going from Fort Dix to Fort McClellan. We had no idea what the experience of going through a tunnel was like. And when you got out the other side, you were gasping for breath, and you were black. And after a while, you just didn't bother trying to clean up. And as I remember, when we got to Fort McClellan, they just hosed us down and put us in a truck. And first thing we did was get a shower and new clothes. On the second day of July, I guess it was in the early afternoon, that's July of '45, I received a phone call telling me to report immediately to headquarters, not to bring anything with me. And I knew what that meant. That meant I was going to be shipped out, because a lot of my friends had been shipped out already. I went over to headquarters, and I can't for the life of me remember where it was. I was up at the Nash building at the time. And after a few minutes, I was admitted to see, I think he was captain by then, Captain Hyde. And I saluted, told him I was reporting, and he immediately read these orders, which said that I was to report to a certain railroad station on the next day, and there was no, they gave me a train number, and that was all. And then after receiving those orders, Captain Hyde wished me well. And I've since learned that Captain Hyde, there's a famous picture of him. He was first lieutenant at that time. And it shows him and a couple of civilians and Colonel Nichols standing side by side. And from the way I read it, using a magnifier, he was receiving the Silver Star for previous action. I know that Colonel Nichols in his book mentions that there were a few officers where they didn't need any technical skills who had been in battle. And that's a story you might look into, Cindy. It's one of Ed Westcott's. But my mother was very ill with cancer and was in a hospice in New York, and I said goodbye to her. And that night I was living with my stepfather and my half-sister Beth, who was a lot younger than me. And I took some time to pack and to procure convert maybe 2/3 of my money into liquid assets, which I knew were going to increase in value appreciably when I got to Dogpatch. We were generally aware of where the Oak Ridge facilities were, and it was, at SAM, it was universally known as Dogpatch. The next day, I got on the train. There was a Pullman porter there, and waiting out near the gate. And when I told him, that I believed he had my orders, he said, "Yes, I do." He said, "You've got," he said, "if you would please take the things you'll need to clean up in the morning, I'll take care of your things." I said, "I hope you'll be very careful. There's some breakables in there." He said, "Oh, yes," he said. And he said, "And one other thing," he said, "we do not accept tips from GIs." He said, "Please don't offer the people in food service a tip." It turned out that the trip down here was very, very much like Glenn Miller's Chattanooga Choo-Choo. We had dinner in the diner, nothing could be finer. And then we had country ham and eggs in Carolina. When I got in, there was a couple other GIs were there, and there was a bus, but Art Kelman and Larry O'Rourke met me. They had an old truck, GI truck, and they discussed for a while whether I should sit in the back, but we managed to get all three of us plus my barracks bag with the valuables in it. And I arrived on the 4th of July, and actually they had taken the day off. They're very limited days off during the war. And one thing that most people don't realize is that during the war, everybody worked 6 days a week. That was a normal work day. Well, we hung out here or there, went to the PX and drank 3.2 beer. The Army had an attitude that they complied with local law. And with the beer, there wasn't much, nobody was going to bootleg beer. And that was one of the first recycling operations. They used to recycle the glass. The next day, I was assigned to a leak testing operation. They still had parts of K-25. I think the construction was pretty well complete, and a lot of it was online. But there was a lot of it that was not finished, and so I ended up on shift. I went out to get some orientation and badges and stuff, and I'll tell you, I was just amazed at the size of K-25. It's just almost inconceivable that they could build a plant like that. But I spent, I guess, about a month leak testing. Work shifts, when I was on day shift, or swing shift, I stayed in Barracks E, where the group from Columbia, there were about a dozen of us, I guess, were all located. The other shift couldn't stay there because the maids would be cleaning up. So there were a couple of, I think there were 4 or 5, maybe more than that, hutments that were just general purpose. People didn't have their equipment there or anything. And we'd sleep there. I'm mentioning that specifically because there's been a lot of talk about the treatment of blacks, and blacks certainly all lived in hutments, and the way they used barbed wire to separate the men from the women wasn't admirable by any means. But the Army had a hard time keeping men and women separated among the whites, too, because a lot of them were married, but didn't have the kind of job that would get them a house. And usually it was the woman who would get caught in the men's storm. Just trying to have normal relations with her husband. But after that, essentially we finished leak testing, and everybody went hunting for a job. I wanted to go back to development and had no problem in doing so. On leak testing, the first thing that one would do when they had a new cell, that's the 6 converters in a cell, which is the unit that can be segregated from the rest of the converters. And first thing they do, they'd pressure using nitrogen. They'd first evacuate it, fill it with nitrogen to maybe about 5 pounds over the normal pressure, normal atmospheric pressure, and look for big leaks. You'd use your ear first, and then you'd go around the likely places and put some soapy water and see if you got bubbles. When you'd pretty well found all the big leaks, you would evacuate the unit, which was hooked up to a helium leak detector. This would detect only helium. It was essentially it was essentially set up, and you would squirt some helium on suspected spots, and this, if they were not leaking, nothing would happen. If they leaked, they would show the gauge would go up, and after a little argument, I was able to convince the fellow who was in charge of the area where I was working that that we had to just put some gunk on that and close it up. They had been just bringing it up to atmospheric pressure and having the welder fix it. But we did that for 8 hours a day, and it was mostly women doing it. When I came down, it was, I think it was more a matter of they were shutting down SAM than it was that they needed me in Oak Ridge. I know Don Trager stayed till the very end, and I think he stayed almost to the end of 45, something like that.
Just because not everybody will know this, the equipment you were testing for leaks was new.
Oh,
right?
yes, it was a state-of-the-art new piece of equipment. And I've had some people ask me, and I can't remember, whether we were using a GE or a Westinghouse leak detector. Apparently, both outfits had made them. They were in use not only at K25, but also at Y12.
So the leak detector itself was a new innovation.
Yeah, yeah. It was made for the project, and it was a necessity, either at K25 or at Y12. They needed to have a perfectly sealed vessel in each case. There was an awful lot that was made entirely for the project. Probably the most significant things were the Calutron at Y12 and the gaseous diffusion barrier at K25. They're still, both of them are still classified. The general idea is used freely, and I think the French have disclosed a lot more than we have, but I really today don't know if people who have Q clearances know anything about the barrier. I made one effort back when we, about 5 years ago, to get a number of old people like me who had worked at the plant and discuss barrier. It got set up in a rather formal arrangement, and it just didn't get all the information maybe I'll take another crack at that. At K25, we used a series of porous membranes. They were in the form of tubes, and about half the gas would flow through the membrane and go down to the stage below. By the stage, I mean there were 6 of these sets of barriers and pumps in each cell, and there were a number of cells in each building. The word building was just for convenience. It was a group of cells that went from the front to the back of the plant. And there were several thousand of these units. Each would enrich a little bit, and that would go to the stage above, and they would take the stuff that had been depleted and to the stage below. The general word for it was a cascade. In the case of the of Y12, Y12 used an electromagnetic separation process. They would vaporize a form of uranium. It was a compound that would vaporize at a lower temperature than pure uranium would. And they'd run it through a tremendously strong magnet, which would separate the U-235 from the U-238. They had to do this twice in the Alpha building. It came up to maybe 15%, something like that, 20%. And then in the Beta buildings, it would get up to weapons grade, which, around 90%, something in that neighborhood. I don't know if anybody's come up with an official definition. One has to be in awe of the engineering accomplishments at the 3 separation plants. The third one was liquid diffusion. This came in later when, and it's sort of a murky story of how Phil Abelson got the word to Colonel Groves that liquid diffusion could function to get a small increment of separation, and then their product could be sent to Y12. And about the time they got this plant built, K-25 had enough cells on stream that Colonel Nichols' brother-in-law had been assigned to develop a system for making the three plants work together. And for the last several months before the bomb was dropped, they ran the thermal diffusion plant. S50 was its code name. And took its product to K-25 and we got further enrichment, and they took the enriched material then to Y12. By the time the bomb was dropped, they K-25 was functioning well enough that Colonel Nichols recommended that the alpha buildings at Y12 and the thermal diffusion plant be shut down because they were both very inefficient compared to gaseous diffusion. As it turned out, this was a wonderful thing for Oak Ridge because it resulted in a lot of people being terminated. And since it was after the war, there was a tremendous number of women working in Oak Ridge. They normally would have been married. They were mostly high school graduates. They normally would have been married and perhaps had a child or two by the time the war was over. And they were very happy to leave as their, in many cases, husbands or boyfriends were released by the Army. This meant that when we came to the end of 45, and it was recommended that the beta buildings in Y12 be shut down. A very sizable portion of the Y12 plant had been had been shut down, so that the layoffs weren't quite as difficult to take. But that period of, well, I guess I want to say something about dropping the bombs. Now, the people I knew, that included the SEDs, the civilians I worked with, the civilians that I met, and we had no thought whatsoever that there be any question about dropping the bomb. We were working on it because it was a means of bringing the war to an end. There was, and it was a military decision. You know, GIs or officers, they didn't question military decisions. The civilians didn't question military decisions. But out at Los Alamos, we had two groups that did question military decisions. We had a group of refugees from Hitler. They were mostly Jewish, but this wasn't a Jewish thing by any means. They had worked diligently to make the bomb when it was thought that it might be used against Germany. There was a smaller group that were pretty leftist. And they ended up making or circulating a paper, and they got the group at the University of Chicago involved in it. My personal feeling is, how could a refugee who had no feeling for Pearl Harbor at all, who had been motivated by his anti-Hitler concept, conceive of what we did in our war with Japan? There were some petitions. They did not have a majority of the people at Chicago who voted on this subject. The people I knew personally at Oak Ridge never questioned this. It was a military decision. Since the war, we've had one group after another raise this question. They apparently all are comfortable in ignoring the number of Japanese lives that were saved by the bomb. Because if we had used conventional weapons and these were used, and the most vivid case was the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed as many people as were killed at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And if we had continued a conventional war and you read different dates, whether it's the 1st of October, the 1st of November, that that war probably would have resulted in 1 million American casualties and probably 10 times that many Japanese. We have a good basis for recognizing this. Iwo Jima was about as bloody a place as there was. And it wasn't just the fighting. It was the Japanese almost had a religion that said you cannot retain your honor if you don't fight to the death. And they were, they certainly, that was certainly a factor in a lot of the Japanese war crimes, was they had no use for Americans who had surrendered. It just wasn't done. So the carnage would have been horrible. I've often thought that I know there hasn't been a good estimate of how many people might have died. They vary all over the map. One thing you can say, though, is it's a lot. It's a great, large number. I want to see if I can get somebody to do the work, because I don't do much anymore. But I'd be very interested in how many Japanese were killed by bombs compared with, and that applies throughout the war. The British started the policy of essentially there were no non-combatants, that combatants, that people who worked on war plants were also the enemy. And you have infamous bombings by both sides in Europe. We bombed the hell out of the Japanese conventionally. We had 5 Japanese cities that were not bombed because they were set aside as targets for the atomic bomb. And I want to reiterate the words that Secretary of War Stinson used in making awards for the participants uh, there were 130,000 at least who worked on the atomic, developing and manufacturing the 2 atomic bombs that were used on Japan. He said that those of us who did that work to make the atomic bombs that brought the war in the Pacific to a satisfactory conclusion. And all of us who did that work are very proud of our work. The people who worked here during the war didn't just pick up and go home. A lot of us stayed here. And one of the great things about working in Oak Ridge was we had a tremendous number of really good-looking women working here. At Y12, they devised the means of having women do just a few things. For instance, they might have a group of women who did routine chemical analysis, and woman A would do a certain thing and pass it through to woman B, who would do something else, and woman X down the line would write out the results of the analysis. And we had women who, the Calutron operators became quite famous, who spent their 8-hour-a-day, 6-day-a-week shift just worrying about 4 or 5 dials and keeping them within the required range. It was an exceedingly important thing because manpower was very, very, everybody was overworked. This country was dedicated, whether you were in service, whether you were civilians, didn't matter. We were dedicated to winning the war. And 6 million women moved to different sites to do war work. And there was probably about 15,000 of them here in Oak Ridge. Many of them on shifts. Shift workers sort of had a life of their own. So I've mentioned women. Now I want to mention a specific group of men, the Special Engineer Detachment, 9812 Technical Service Unit. There were 1,240 47 or some number like that of us working here at all of the plants and the castle on the hill. And a number of us stayed here after the war. And one of the great attractions that kept us here was the fact that we had all those beautiful women. And I can speak personally of this subject because on Thanksgiving Day of 1945, I met Ollie V. Littleton of Grayson, Kentucky. Grayson is about 25 miles from the West Virginia border. Go another 10 miles and you're in Huntington, West Virginia. She gave me credit anyway for changing her first name to Audrey on our first date. But, and I guess that we dated continuously until we got married. But I know of so many of my friends where well, for instance, you remember Bob and Evelyn Ellingson? You did Bob was from Idaho. Evelyn was from Alabama. I was from New Jersey. Audrey was from, as she would call it, the Kentucky Hill Country. It was very common. She continued working until the summer of 49, and I can remember our neighbors from downstairs had come up on the day before Gates opening day. And Audrey was petite when she got her wedding dress in at May McCampbell in Knoxville. I was told, keep my eye on the street. If I found out what that wedding dress was, the wedding was off. Well, no restraints were put on my ears, and I heard these two sales ladies talking, and one of them said, I am helping this lovely little girl select her wedding dress. He said, you know, she's 98 pounds and 5'3", and she's 31, 20, 32. The size 3. Well, I didn't reveal that for a little while. But on that day in '49, we decided that we'd just go as far as we could and walk. And Phil and Myrtle Bracy were their names. They were older than us. And Phil and I were having a drink and talking, and all of a sudden Myrtle says, "Hey guys, plans have changed. We're going to take Audrey to the maternity ward." And about 4 o'clock on Gaseous opening day, Dr. Dings came in and told me, "Bill, you've got a beautiful little girl." And I was smiling, and Dr. Dings said, "And Bill, you've got a second beautiful little girl." And I I was in heaven, and I went up, and eventually he said that someone would come get me, but I knew where the maternity ward was, so I figured I'd waited long enough. And they had sort of a pretty strong-willed nurse in charge of things. And she told Audrey, she said, "Miss Tewes," she said, "kiss your husband and we're going to get you to sleep till 11 tomorrow." Audrey just laughed at her. And she said, "Nobody sleeps till 11 in a hospital." But she told me now, she said, "I'm going to drive you home." And I said, "Well, first I'd like to see my daughters." But she reminded me the buses were on strike. And next day, Gates opening day was a very festive thing here. We had movie stars and politicians, but I learned at the time that the mother has the privilege of naming the child. At least Audrey made it very clear to me that I was welcome at the conception, but from then on I hadn't really done a damn thing. And I had suggested Olivia Ann, and her response was oat. I'd never thought of the initials. So she had told me about Madeline and Lee before, and actually she did say that I might be privileged to make suggestions on the middle name. But, and Amelia Ann was her sister. We added 2 more girls. And you couldn't ask for a better place to raise children than Oak Ridge. Uh, at that time, the semester house area, we lived on Venus Road. Our first, Ellen was born there, and then we moved to our current house on East Forest, and had Rebecca there rather late in life, which keeps you young.
Well, that's a lovely story. I think that we should probably wrap up. We probably should end. Is there anything that you suppose haven't covered in all of this that you want to say, or shall we just sign off? You've had some wonderful things you've contributed.
Yes, I think there's one other thing I want to say. You're not down here on a fun trip. You're here because Bill Wilcox died. And I worked for Bill directly, or maybe with one person in between us, for probably about 40 years, both at K25 and at Y12. I got to appreciate him more than most people have. I got to know him very well. And he's the closest to being I'm having trouble coming up with the right word. But Bill was interested in everything. He was a very effective person. And the city has lost a great deal. I have been going through a bad period because it seems like about every month before Bill was Hal McCurdy. I've known Hal, well, when Audrey and I were courting, we mainly did things with SEDs, but Hal was one of the few I got to know early on from Y12. And then about a month before that, Evelyn Owens. And you know, Evelyn was certainly Audrey's most cherished friend. And I became good friends with her and Bob many, many years ago. And before that, Viola Ergen. I don't know if you know Viola. Her husband Bill died much too young, and he was the one who came up with the China syndrome idea, and who really got the attention of the need for increasing our knowledge on oh, I can't think of the name of it. And Viola was a very good friend of Audrey's from Girl Scouts. Audrey had been chairman of the Girl Scouts in town for a number of years. There are over 900 of them. So this isn't a very good day for me.
Well, it is a
And
sad
I'm sure
time.
it isn't for
It's a
you.
sad